They say your wedding day is supposed to be the most beautiful day of your life. They say you'll remember it forever. The flowers, the music, the way the person you love looks at you from across the room. They're right. I do remember it forever. But not for any of those reasons. I remember the laughter. Not the sweet kind. The sharp, ugly kind that cuts through a room and lands right in the center of your chest. I remember the whispers. I remember the moment I looked down at my dress. The dress I had saved for, worked for, dreamed about, and felt something cold and wet spreading across the fabric. And I remember the silence that followed. That horrible, suspended silence where everyone in that room was watching me, and not a single person on my husband's side got up to help. But here's the thing about silence. Sometimes it gives you time to think, and sometimes what you think in that silence changes everything. My name is Claire, and I need to tell you what happened on the day I got married, and what happened in the 3 years after, because if I don't, I think I'll carry this alone forever, and I've carried enough alone in my life. So let's go back. Back to before the wedding, back to the very beginning, when I first met the family that would one day make me feel like I was nothing. Back to when I still believed love was enough to protect you. I was 26 years old when I met Daniel. He was tall, easygoing, the kind of man who laughed with his whole body and made you feel like the only person in any room. I met him at a friend's birthday dinner. He was seated across from me, and by the end of the night, we had talked so long that the restaurant staff were stacking chairs around us. He called me the next morning. Not the next day, the next morning. 7:42 a.m. I thought that was either the most romantic thing I had ever heard or the most alarming. Turned out it was both. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Those 2 years were genuinely some of the best of my life. Daniel was kind. He was attentive. He remembered small things, the name of my childhood dog, that I hated cilantro, that my favorite season was early autumn when the leaves just start to turn. The only thing that ever gave me a quiet, uncomfortable feeling, the kind you push down because you don't want to be the person who makes a problem out of nothing, was his family. I want to be careful here because I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. Daniel had a younger sister, Priya, who was genuinely lovely. Quiet, thoughtful, always kind to me from the first day we met. Priya was the exception. The rest of them were something else entirely. His mother, Margaret, was a woman who had built her entire identity around 2 things: her family name and her social standing. She came from old money, not extraordinary wealth, but enough that she had grown up believing certain doors were open to her that were closed to most people. She was the kind of woman who asked you what your parents did for work within 5 minutes of meeting you, and whose smile changed depending on your answer. When she first met me, I told her my mother was a retired nurse and my father had worked in logistics before he passed. The smile didn't disappear, but it shifted, just slightly, just enough. His father, Robert, was quieter. A man who had spent 30 years letting Margaret run the social calendar, the family narrative, and the unspoken rules of who belonged and who didn't. He wasn't cruel by nature. He was just absent. The kind of absent that still causes damage, because silence in the face of cruelty is never really neutral. And then there was Daniel's older brother, Marcus. Marcus was the problem. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. Not the kind of problem you can point to and say, look, there it is. Marcus was the kind of problem that lives in small moments. The offhand comment. The joke that goes just a little too far. The way he would look at you while he was laughing with someone else, making sure you knew the laugh was about you. Marcus had decided, from the very first time Daniel brought me around, that I was not good enough for his brother. He never said it directly. He didn't have to. It was in the way he called me Danny's little project once, laughing when I looked confused, saying he was just kidding. It was in the way he would bring up other women from Daniel's past at family dinners, always casually, always with a smile. Women who had the right last names, the right backgrounds, the right connections. It was in the way he looked at my hands once, my hands, which were calloused from years of working 2 jobs to get through school, and said, You must have worked really hard to get here. A compliment on the surface, a reminder underneath. Daniel always brushed it off. That's just Marcus, he would say. He's like that with everyone. Don't let him get to you. I wish I had said more then. I wish I had been braver then. But I was young and I was in love and I wanted so badly for his family to accept me that I convinced myself I was the one being too sensitive. That was my first mistake. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday evening in October. We were walking through the park near our apartment, the one with the old oak trees and the wooden bridge over the small creek. And he stopped in the middle of the bridge and pulled a ring out of his coat pocket. No crowd, no performance, just the two of us and the sound of water and the smell of fallen leaves. I said yes before he finished asking. We were happy that night. Genuinely, completely happy. We called our friends. We called my mother, who cried so hard I could barely understand her. We opened a bottle of wine we had been saving for a special occasion, and we sat on our kitchen floor at midnight eating takeout and making plans. It was one of the last nights that felt entirely uncomplicated. The next morning, Daniel called his family. His mother's response to the news was not what I had hoped for. She did not cry happy tears. She did not ask to speak to me. She said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the tone you use when someone tells you they've made a decision you disagree with, but you've decided to let them make it anyway. Then she said, "We'll need to have dinner soon. There are things to discuss." Things to discuss. I remember Daniel hanging up the phone and looking at me with a smile that was just slightly too bright. "She's excited," he said. "She just needs time to process." I nodded. I smiled back. I ignored the small cold knot forming in my stomach. The dinner was 2 weeks later. Margaret had hosted it at their house, a large, beautifully decorated home in an older part of the city, the kind of house that had a formal dining room that was only used for people being formally evaluated. That night, it was used for me. Margaret had prepared a multi-course meal, which I would have found touching if the conversation over that meal hadn't made me feel like I was sitting in a job interview I hadn't applied for. She asked about my career. I was a graphic designer, working at a mid-size agency. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're filing information under acceptable but not impressive. She asked about my family background, about where I had grown up, about my education. She asked whether I planned to continue working after we were married, and when I said yes, absolutely, she said, "How practical," in a tone that made practical sound like something you scraped off the bottom of your shoe. Robert ate quietly and said very little. Marcus was at his most charming that night, which was somehow worse than when he was obviously dismissive. He complimented my dress. He asked intelligent questions about my work. He made Daniel laugh twice with stories from their childhood. And then, near the end of the meal, he looked across the table at me with that particular smile of his and said, "You know, Claire, I have to say, Danny's always gone his own way, always done what he wanted regardless of what anyone thought. We love that about him." A pause. "I think it's sweet that you two found each other." It sounds kind. Written down, it looks like a compliment. But the way he said it, the emphasis on regardless of what anyone thought, the pause before sweet, made it something else entirely. Daniel laughed. He thought Marcus was being warm. I sat there with my wine glass in my hand, and I smiled and I said thank you. And inside I was already building the walls I would need to get through whatever was coming next. The wedding planning began, and with it, a steady, relentless campaign by Margaret to shape it into something that reflected her vision of the family rather than anything Daniel or I had imagined. She wanted a venue we couldn't afford. She offered to pay for it, which seemed generous until the strings became clear. If she paid for it, she controlled the guest list. And her guest list was 90 people we had never met, contacts and acquaintances and distant relatives whose presence at our wedding was entirely for the benefit of her social calendar. She wanted a specific caterer, the one her friends used. She wanted a specific florist. She had opinions about the invitations, the table arrangements, the order of the ceremony. Daniel, to his credit, pushed back on some things, but not enough things, and not loudly enough. I remember one evening, about 4 months before the wedding, when Daniel and I had a real argument about it. Not a surface argument, a deep one. I told him I felt like his mother was taking over. I told him I felt invisible in the planning of our own wedding. I told him that every time I suggested something, it was either dismissed or adjusted until it no longer resembled anything I had wanted. He got defensive. He said I was being unfair. He said his mother was just trying to help. He said she's always been involved in things. It doesn't mean anything. It means something to me, I said. That was the truest thing I said in that whole argument. He apologized later. He always apologized later. And things would improve for a week or two, and then the tide would come back in. I should have listened to what those cycles were telling me. About Daniel. About the marriage I was walking into. But I loved him. And love at that age has a very loud voice that tends to drown out the quieter, wiser ones. So I kept going. I kept planning. I made my compromises, and I bit my tongue, and I told myself that once the wedding was over, once we were married and in our own life together, things would settle. I had no idea what was coming on that day. No idea at all. The morning of our wedding was beautiful. I'm not being sentimental. It genuinely was. Early June, the sky the particular shade of blue you only see a few times a year, warm without being hot. My mother helped me into my dress in the bridal suite of the venue, a hotel with a garden for the ceremony and a reception hall that could hold 200 people. My dress was something I had chosen myself, over Margaret's suggestions and mild objections. It was ivory, fitted through the bodice, with a simple lace overlay and a modest train. It was elegant, and it was mine, and when I looked in the mirror that morning, I felt genuinely and completely beautiful. My mother held my face in her hands and said, "Your father would have been so proud." I held it together, barely. The ceremony was everything I had hoped for. Daniel cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. Real tears, the kind you can't fake. And for those 30 minutes, standing across from him in that garden with the sunlight coming through the oak trees, I forgot every difficult thing and just felt the love that had started it all. We were married. We were happy. We walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, and everything felt possible. And then we got to the reception. The reception had been set up in the hall adjoining the garden. Round tables, white linens, flowers. It was beautiful. My side of the family, my mother, my aunts, my friends, were already seated, and they were warm and loud and full of joy. Daniel's side was also seated. Margaret was at a table near the center. Marcus was at a table with several of Daniel's college friends. I didn't notice anything wrong at first. We did the introductions. We had the first dance. I danced with my mother, and she whispered in my ear that I was the most beautiful bride she had ever seen, and for a moment, everything was perfect. The toasts began. Daniel's best man gave a funny, genuine speech. One of my closest friends gave a speech that made half the room cry. Then Marcus stood up. He gave a toast that was, on the surface, perfectly charming. He talked about Daniel growing up. He told a story about a family vacation. He said how glad he was to welcome me into the family. He raised his glass. But the stories he chose, they were all about Daniel before me. The implication running underneath the whole speech, invisible to anyone who didn't know the history, was that Daniel had been fully formed and complete before I arrived. That I was an addition, an accessory, a footnote in a story that was already written. I raised my glass. I smiled. I kept going. Then dinner was served. I don't know exactly how it happened. I don't know if it was deliberate or careless or something in between. What I know is that a server, one of the catering staff that Margaret had hired, was pouring red wine at our table, and somehow, some way, an entire glass of red wine ended up poured directly down the front of my wedding dress. The gasp from the room was immediate. My mother was on her feet instantly, reaching for napkins, her face pale with horror. My friends rushed over. The server stood there, stammering apologies. And Daniel's family? Margaret stayed in her seat. She pressed her lips together and looked away. Not at me, away from me, as if the sight of me standing there in my ruined dress was somehow an inconvenience to her evening. Marcus looked at his phone. Robert stared at the table. Not one person from Daniel's family stood up. That was the moment. That specific, terrible moment when I understood exactly where I stood. The room was watching. 200 people, and every single one of them saw exactly who stood up and who stayed seated. My mother was next to me, dabbing at my dress with water and napkins, whispering soft, urgent things. My friends formed a small circle around me. They were all that stood between me and the full exposure of that moment. Daniel did come to me. He did put his arm around me and guide me away from the table. He was distressed, genuinely distressed. He held my hand tightly. But when I looked over my shoulder and saw his mother still seated, looking at her wine glass, I felt something change inside me. Not break, change. Like a material that bends under pressure but doesn't snap. It just becomes a different shape. We got me to the bridal suite. My mother and two of my friends worked on the dress, while Daniel stood by the door looking helpless and pale. "Did you see?" I asked him. "Did you see that no one from your family moved? Claire, did you see it or not?" He was quiet for a moment. "I saw it." "And?" "I'll talk to them." "When?" He didn't answer. I changed into the backup outfit my mother, because my mother had known, somewhere deep down, that something would go wrong, had quietly packed and brought along. A simple white wrap dress, nothing like what I had imagined, but something. I went back to my wedding reception in a different dress than the one I had walked down the aisle in. I smiled. I danced. I thanked people for coming. I clinked glasses and cut the cake and did every single thing you are supposed to do at your wedding, because I had 200 people watching me, and I was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. But inside, behind every smile and every gracious thank you, something was very quietly, very carefully being decided. I want to be honest about what the next 3 years looked like, because I think it's important. I don't want to tell a simple story. Life is never simple. There were good times, real ones. Daniel and I had a life together that had genuine warmth in it. We traveled, we built a home, we laughed. There were evenings curled up on the sofa watching terrible movies, and mornings where the light came through the kitchen window just right and everything felt easy and good. But there were also the other times, the ones that built up slowly, the way water erodes stone, not dramatically, not with a crash, but steadily, invisibly, until one day you look down and the stone is just gone. Margaret never apologized for what happened at the wedding. Not directly. About 2 weeks after, she called Daniel and said she was sorry things had gone so badly, which was not the same thing as being sorry for her own behavior, and both Daniel and I knew it. Daniel accepted it. He reported it to me with a tone of relief, as if the matter were now settled. I said nothing. The family gatherings continued. Christmas, Easter, summer barbecues. Every one of them a performance I had to prepare for. I got better and better at the performance. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed at Marcus's jokes. I complimented Margaret's cooking. I asked Robert about his golf game. Inside, I was noting everything. Every small moment. Everything that was said and not said. Not from anger, or not only from anger. From a growing, steady sense that I needed to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. Because something had happened to me on my wedding day that I hadn't fully understood until much later. When I stood in that reception hall in my ruined dress and looked at Daniel's family staying in their seats, I hadn't just felt hurt. I had felt the truth of my situation with absolute clarity. I had felt it the way you feel cold water, unmistakably, completely, with your whole body. And that clarity never really went away. About 18 months into our marriage, I started a freelance design business on the side. Small at first, extra projects in the evenings and on weekends, building a client base, learning the business side of things. I told Daniel about it. He was supportive in the way people are supportive when they don't think something will amount to much. "That's great, babe," he said, and went back to his book. I built it anyway. By the time 2 years had passed, my freelance income was matching my salary at the agency. By the time 2.5 years had passed, it had surpassed it. I left the agency. I was running my own business, with 5 regular clients, 2 part-time contractors I had brought on to help, and a revenue that surprised even me. I didn't talk about this much at family gatherings. Margaret asked about my work once, briefly. I gave a vague answer about doing some design projects. She nodded the way she always nodded and moved on to something else. I let her. Marcus, at one Christmas dinner, asked what I had been up to. I said I'd been busy with work. He made a joke about designers, something about moving boxes around, and the table laughed. I smiled pleasantly. I did not correct him. The trouble in my marriage came to a head about 2.5 years in, not in a dramatic explosion, in a long, quiet erosion that I think both Daniel and I had been watching for some time without saying anything. He had never fully separated himself from his family. That was the core of it. He loved them, and he respected them, and when it came to a choice between standing beside me and maintaining peace with his family, he almost always chose the peace. He never put it in those terms. He would have been horrified if I had. But that was what was happening. The moment that brought it to a head was not a big moment. It was a small one. We were at a Sunday dinner at Margaret and Robert's house. Margaret said something at the table, something about how it was a shame Daniel and I hadn't bought a house in their neighborhood, said with the specific implication that we had chosen poorly by not doing so. I responded calmly that we liked where we lived. Margaret said, "Of course you do, dear." That tone, that "of course you do, dear" tone that had been present since the very first dinner, that contained within it the full weight of everything she thought about me, where I came from, what I was worth, whether I belonged. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his plate. That was it. That small, quiet, devastating moment. His eyes on his plate, his hands around his fork, his silence. I drove home without saying a word. We sat in our kitchen for a long time, and then I told Daniel that I needed him to choose, not between me and his family, but between the person he wanted to be and the person he was becoming by staying silent. I told him that his silence wasn't neutral, that every time he said nothing, he was saying something. He listened. He was hurt. He was defensive, and then he was honest, and then he was sad. We talked for a very long time, and in the end, he admitted something I had not known he was carrying. He told me that his mother had, in the month before our wedding, asked him to consider whether he was making the right choice, not dramatically, over coffee, quietly, the way Margaret did everything that mattered. She had told him she just wanted him to be happy. She had talked about compatibility, about backgrounds, about the kind of family you want to build. He hadn't told me. He'd gone ahead and married me, which he said was because he loved me and he was sure. But he'd never told me. And he'd never confronted his mother about it either. He had chosen peace instead, and that peace had cost both of us. We went to counseling. 3 months of it, and I am grateful for those 3 months because they helped me see things clearly in a way I hadn't before. Not just about Daniel, about myself, about what I had accepted, about the ways I had made myself small to try to fit into a space that was never really being offered to me. The counselor was a quiet, thoughtful woman who asked very precise questions. In one session, she asked me what I wanted. Not what I wanted from Daniel. What I wanted, for myself, for my life. I sat with that question for a long time. I knew the answer. I just wasn't sure, yet, whether I was brave enough to live it. I want to tell you about the moment I stopped being afraid. It happened on a Tuesday morning in March, about 3 years after our wedding. I was at my desk in the home office I had converted from our spare room, the spare room that had become, over 3 years, the heartbeat of my business. I had just gotten off a call with a new client, a significant one, a corporate account that had come through a referral, the kind of account that changes the shape of what's possible. I sat back in my chair. I looked around the room, the whiteboards covered in project notes, the shelves with the design books I'd been collecting for years, the framed copy of my business registration certificate that I had put up as a joke, but also not really as a joke. And I thought, I did this. While smiling at dinners, while absorbing every, "Of course you do, dear," while driving home in silence, I built this. Something settled in me. Something that had been restless and uncertain for 3 years just settled. I'm going to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. Revenge is not what they show you in movies. It is not a single dramatic moment with a perfect line and a door slamming. Real revenge, the kind that actually matters, is quieter than that. It is the long game. It is choosing, over and over and over, to build something real rather than destroying something empty. I had been building, and now I had something to show for it. But I also want to be honest with you. Things with Daniel had not improved enough. 3 months of counseling had created clarity and some real conversations. But the fundamental dynamic had not changed. He still needed his family's approval more than he needed to stand fully beside me. He was a good person, a kind person in many real ways. But we wanted different things. I understood that now. So I made 2 decisions. The first, I was going to end my marriage. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of clarity, out of respect, for myself, for him, for the reality of what we had become. The second, I was not going to do it quietly and disappear. I was not going to shrink. I was going to be exactly and fully myself. And if the people who had spent 3 years deciding I wasn't good enough happened to discover exactly what I had been building in silence, then so be it. I told Daniel I wanted to separate. The conversation was long and painful and real. He was hurt. I was also hurt. We were 2 people who had genuinely loved each other coming to the honest conclusion that the shape of what they needed was not the shape of what they had built together. That is not a simple thing. That is not a clean thing. But it was the true thing. He moved out 2 weeks later. I stayed in the house. I could afford it now on my own, more than afford it. I sat in it for a few days in the strange echo of a newly empty space, and then I went back to my desk and I went back to work. Now comes the part of the story where things get interesting. The separation had been handled quietly. Daniel had told his family, of course. I imagine that conversation very differently than how it might have looked to an outsider. Marcus, I later heard through Daniel's sister Priya, the only member of the family who continued to treat me with genuine warmth throughout everything, had apparently said something along the lines of, "I always thought it was too different," meaning us. Meaning me and Daniel. Margaret had apparently received the news with something between sadness and a relief she tried very hard to hide. None of them knew. That's what I want you to understand. None of them knew what was actually happening. 6 months after Daniel moved out, my business reached a milestone I had been working toward for 2 years. We landed a contract, our biggest to date, with a national retail brand that was refreshing their entire visual identity. It was a 6-figure contract. For a company I had started alone in a spare room. I also made an acquisition. A small but established local design studio that had been in business for 15 years, whose founder was retiring and wanted to sell to someone who would continue the culture she had built. I spent 4 months in quiet conversations with her. And then I bought it. Combined with my existing client base, I now owned a studio with 8 full-time designers, a portfolio of 30-plus clients, and revenue that would have made Margaret's "Of course you do, dear," completely incomprehensible if she had known about it. She didn't know. Not yet. Priya knew. Priya and I had kept in regular contact. She had come to me after the separation and told me she was ashamed of how her family had treated me. She said it simply and directly, without caveats. I loved her for that. We had lunch together every few weeks, and over one of those lunches I told her what I had built. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed. The good kind, the kind full of genuine delight. "Claire," she said, "they have no idea, do they? Not a clue, I said. She shook her head slowly, still smiling. You know this is going to come out eventually. I know. What are you going to do when it does? I thought about it. I thought about my wedding dress, ivory turning red. I thought about Margaret's hands around her wine glass while I stood there. I thought about, of course you do, dear, and Marcus's jokes about designers moving boxes around. Nothing dramatic, I said. I don't need to do anything dramatic. I just need to be there when it does. It came out in a way I could never have planned. 9 months after Daniel and I separated, Robert, Daniel's father, retired from the company where he had worked for 3 decades. Margaret organized a retirement celebration, a dinner party at their home, roughly 40 people, the extended family, close friends, work colleagues. Priya called me a week before. Mum is going to invite you, she said, through Daniel. She thinks it would be, I'm quoting here, the gracious thing to do. I paused. She wants me there? I think she wants to demonstrate that the separation was handled maturely, that there are no hard feelings. It would look good for her. A pause. I told her I thought she should invite you because you're still my friend and because you deserve to be treated like a person. But that's not the version she's going with. I smiled. Should I go? I think, Priya said carefully, that if you want to go, you should go. And I think if you go, you should bring your business cards. I laughed. I went. I dressed carefully, not to impress, just to be exactly and fully myself. I wore a dark blue dress that I knew was well cut and confident without trying too hard. I wore my hair the way I liked it. I wore the small diamond earrings my mother had given me for my 31st birthday. When I arrived, Margaret received me at the door with a warmth that was precisely calibrated, warm enough to be polite, cool enough to make a point. Claire, she said, how lovely you came. The smile, the particular smile. Thank you for including me, I said. She stepped back to let me in. The evening was going fine. Robert was happy, genuinely happy, the loosened, open happiness of a man stepping out of a long responsibility into rest. I was glad for him. I always had been. His quiet passivity had hurt me, but I understood by now that it came from a place of exhaustion rather than cruelty. I mingled. I spoke to people I hadn't seen in months. I had a conversation with a woman named Eleanor, a colleague of Robert's wife, who turned out to be delightful, and we talked for nearly half an hour about design and visual identity, and she asked for my card. I gave it to her. My card, which had my name, my studio name, and my title, creative director and owner. Eleanor's eyebrows went up just slightly. You own the studio? I do. We started about 2.5 years ago and recently acquired an established studio, so now we're a team of 8. That's remarkable, she said with genuine warmth. What kind of work do you do primarily? We talked for another 20 minutes. I was aware, at the edge of my vision, that Marcus was watching this conversation. Later, when Eleanor had moved on, Marcus appeared beside me with 2 glasses of wine. He offered me one. I took it. He looked at me with that same smile, not quite as confident as usual. I didn't know you were running your own business, he said. It never really came up, I said pleasantly. Eleanor seems impressed. She's kind. I took a sip of wine. Your studio? What's it called? I told him. A tiny pause. Wait, I know that name. Do you? He was pulling out his phone now, searching it. His expression went through several phases in quick succession. This is a piece we did research on. At work, we were looking for a design firm for a project. He looked up. You own this? I do. Another pause, longer this time. How long? The original business? About 3 years. We acquired the studio earlier this year. He put his phone away. He looked at me, not with contempt, not with the smile, just looked at me, the way you look at something you've been seeing incorrectly and are only now starting to see right. You built that while you were... He stopped. While I was married to Daniel, yes. He had nothing to say to that. I excused myself pleasantly and went to find Priya. I was not expecting the conversation with Margaret. It happened near the end of the evening. Most of the guests had gone. I was saying goodbye to Robert, giving him a genuine warm hug, telling him congratulations, meaning every word, when Margaret appeared beside us. "Could I speak with you for a moment, Claire?" she said. Her voice was different. Not the calibrated warmth, not the polite performance, just her voice. I looked at Priya, who gave me the smallest nod. "Of course," I said. We went to the sitting room off the hallway. It was quiet there. Margaret sat in the armchair by the window. I sat across from her. She looked at me for a long moment. This woman who had made me feel small in so many small ways over so many years. This woman who had stayed seated while I stood in a ruined wedding dress. Who had said, "Of course you do, dear," in that voice. Who had, over coffee before my wedding, tried to talk her son out of marrying me. She looked old to me in that moment. Not elderly, she was in her early 60s, but old in the way that people look when they've been carrying something they're tired of carrying. "Eleanor Whitmore has been looking for a design firm for 6 months," she said. "Her foundation is undergoing a complete rebrand. She called me on her way home tonight and told me she was going to contact your studio tomorrow." "That's wonderful," I said. "She said she didn't know you were this accomplished." A pause. "Neither did I." I waited. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said. The words came out carefully, like someone disarming something. "For which part?" I asked. Not unkindly, genuinely. She looked at her hands. "For a great many things. For the wedding. For how I spoke to Daniel before it. For the way I treated you when you were a part of this family." I sat with that for a moment. There is a version of the story where I said something cutting, where I listed every hurt and laid them out on the table between us, where I made her feel the full weight of what she had done. But that is not what I did, because somewhere in the 3 years of building something in silence, somewhere in the 200 small choices to keep going instead of burning down, I had spent all the anger. It wasn't gone. Nothing like that is ever fully gone. But it had been transformed into something else. Into the business. Into the life I had built. Into the woman sitting across from Margaret, who no longer needed Margaret's approval to know her own worth. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I mean it." "Are you happy?" she asked. And I believe she meant it. Imperfectly. Too late. Through the particular distortion of a woman who had never fully questioned her own assumptions, but sincerely. "I am," I said. "I genuinely am." I stood. I offered her my hand. She shook it. I left. I want to tell you about now. Not a fairy tale ending. Not a dramatic triumph with fireworks. Just now. My studio has 12 designers. We work with clients across 5 industries. We won an industry award last year for a campaign we designed for a nonprofit working in education access. When I stood at that ceremony and accepted that award, I thought about the spare room. I thought about the evenings after family dinners when I came home and went directly to my desk and worked, because work was the one place where I was entirely and completely myself. I am not married. I have dated, carefully, thoughtfully, with the particular clarity you develop when you've learned the cost of ignoring your instincts. I have not found the person yet, but I am not afraid of that. My mother and I talk every Sunday morning. She asks about the business, about my life, about whether I'm eating well and sleeping enough. She worries because mothers worry. I tell her I'm good, and I mean it. Priya and I are close friends. We have dinner together at least twice a month. She recently started her own small business, something she told me she was inspired to do partly because of watching what I built. I am so proud of her I can barely contain it. Daniel and I have a civil relationship. We don't see each other often, but when we do, there is no bitterness. There is sadness sometimes, the particular sadness of something that was real and is now over, but not bitterness. I think we were each other's important lessons, if that makes sense. He taught me what I couldn't accept. I think I taught him something about what it costs to stay silent. Marcus, and I include this not for drama, but because I think it matters, sent me a message about 8 months ago. It was a professional inquiry at first. His company was looking for a design firm. He had found my studio. He wrote professionally, and then at the end added a few sentences that surprised me. I know we haven't always been kind to you. I wanted to say that for what it's worth, I think I had you wrong. I hope things are going well. I thought about it for a day. Then I replied professionally and told him we would be happy to take a meeting. We did not get his company's account in the end. The project went in a different direction. But he and I have crossed paths at a couple of industry events since, and he treats me differently. I notice it. It doesn't change anything that happened, but I notice it. And Margaret? Eleanor Whitmore's foundation did hire my studio. We did the full rebrand over 8 months, and it was one of the projects I am most proud of. I attended a presentation of the final work at the foundation's offices. Margaret was there. She sits on the foundation's board. She saw the presentation. She watched the room respond to what we had made. Afterward, she found me in the hallway and said simply, "It's beautiful work, Claire." "Thank you," I said. That was it. That was enough. I've been thinking about what I actually want you to take from this. It would be easy to frame this as a revenge story. Woman humiliated, woman builds empire, woman gets the last word. That arc exists in this story. I won't pretend it doesn't. There is satisfaction in it. I would be lying if I told you there wasn't a quiet, fierce joy in handing Eleanor Whitmore my business card that night. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is messier. The whole truth is that I spent 3 years in a marriage I should have left sooner. The whole truth is that I let too many things go unchallenged because I was afraid of being seen as difficult. The whole truth is that some of the people who underestimated me were also people who were carrying their own fears and limitations, and cruelty is almost never just about the person it's aimed at. Here is what I actually want to tell you. The first thing is this: your work is your power. Not in a material sense, not in a show them by making money sense. In the deeper sense that what you build, the genuine craft and effort and intelligence you bring to the world, is something no one can take from you. It is yours. Margaret's opinion of me was never able to touch what I was building in that spare room, because what I was building was real, and her opinion was just air. The second thing is this: silence is not the same as peace. I was silent for years about things that needed to be said. Daniel was silent about things that needed to be said. Margaret was silent after the wedding about things that needed to be said. None of that silence was peaceful. It was all just postponed pain. Speak. Carefully, yes. Thoughtfully, yes. But speak. The third thing is this: other people's limitations are not your ceiling. Margaret looked at me and saw someone who wasn't enough. That was a story she was telling herself based on her own fears and her own rigid understanding of the world. I had a choice: to live inside her story or to write my own. It took me too long to make that choice. But I made it. And the choice was available to me all along. And the last thing, the most important one: what happened at that wedding, with the wine and the ruined dress and the people staying seated, that was real. That hurt. I don't want to wrap it in inspiration and make it pretty. It was humiliating, and it was wrong, and I deserved better. You deserve better too, whatever version of that story you are carrying. But I will tell you what I learned from that moment. When I stood in that reception hall with red wine spreading across my wedding dress, and I looked at Daniel's family sitting still in their seats, and I felt the full weight of what that silence meant. In that moment, something clarified. The truth of my situation became absolutely clear, and that clarity, as painful as it was the beginning of everything. Sometimes the thing that breaks your heart is also the thing that finally sets you free. I am free now. The dress is long gone. The business is real. The life I have is mine. And if I could go back and speak to the woman standing in that reception hall, the one holding herself together behind her smile, the one making 1,000 small decisions about how to survive the evening, I would say this: you don't need them to stand up for you. You're about to stand up for yourself, and that is going to be more than enough.